Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm Rebecca Larson. It's Women's History Month. Well, let's be honest, it's always Women's History Month on this show. But today I want to share with you a story of a Plantagenet princess that we seldom hear about, Katherine of York, the Countess of Devon.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
In 1479, at Eltham Palace, Katherine Plantagenet, or Katherine of York, was born to Elizabeth Woodville and King Edward IV of England. She was their 9th child and their 2nd youngest daughter. Eltham Palace boasts a rich and storied history, its origins tracing back to the 14th century when it was bestowed upon Edward II by the Bishop of Durham. From that pivotal moment onward, it stood as a cherished royal residence. Initially, Eltham was a moated palace under the patronage of the bishopric and was already exuding grandeur. However, it reached new heights of magnificence during the reign of Edward IV, who oversaw the construction of the awe-inspiring Great Hall. This Great Hall was second only to Westminster Hall, as Eltham's Great Hall stands as the largest pre-Tudor aisleless halls in the nation. For those who are interested in the Tudor side of its history, Eltham Palace was where Henry VIII was raised with his sisters Margaret and Mary under the guidance of their mother, Elizabeth of York, Catherine's sister. The life of a princess is never her own, as we often discover. This was no different for Katherine of York. She was nearly a month old when negotiations began with the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, to wed their son, Juan of Aragon, to this English princess. Unfortunately for everyone, the unexpected death of Edward IV in 1483 ended any marriage negotiations. Juan went on to marry Margaret of Austria in 1497, only to die a few months later. When Catherine's uncle Richard usurped the throne in 1483, he did so by having his widowed sister-in-law Elizabeth Woodville's marriage to his brother Edward declared invalid. The reason? Well, he believed that his brother already had a wife when he wed the beautiful daughter of Jacquetta of Luxembourg. So, because of this action, all of the children of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville were declared illegitimate, and thus could not rule the kingdom. So Richard ruled instead. After Richard III was killed at the Battle of Bosworth, the new king, Henry VII, wed Catherine's sister, Elizabeth of York. In order to wed the Plantagenet princess, however, Henry had to have her declared legitimate again, alongside all of her siblings, including Katherine. When Katherine was 8 years old, her brother-in-law, King Henry VII, began negotiations with James III of Scotland to have her wed his second son, James, Duke of Ross. Now, if you recall from a previous episode about Catherine's older sister, Cecily, well, Cecily was being matched with his eldest son, James, Duke of Rothesay, future James IV. Now, in these same negotiations, their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was being negotiated to wed James III as well. Seriously, nothing like creating a really strong bond with Scotland. But alas, it would not happen for any of them. In 1495, when Katherine was 16, she was matched with William Courtenay, son and heir of the Earl of Devon. To Henry VII, the marriage was a strong one, as William's father was a staunch supporter of the Lancastrian cause during the Wars of the Roses. William Courtenay's family was also descended from Edward I of England, making the marriage a good match for a Plantagenet princess. About a year later, the couple welcomed a son. They called him Henry, after the king. The following year, they welcomed another son, Edward, who would die as a small child. And then a daughter, Margaret. Seeing as Katherine was the queen's sister and William was in great favor with Henry VII, both spent immense amount of time at the Tudor court performing their royal duties. When they were not at court, they spent their time in Devon at either Tiverton or Colcombe castles. In 1501, Katherine, like her sisters, was present at the marriage of her nephew, Prince Arthur, to Katherine of Aragon, as well as the betrothal of her niece, Princess Margaret, to James IV in 1502. The connection to Scotland that Henry VII had attempted earlier on in his reign finally came to fruition, making Scotland an ally. The favor that the couple once garnered came to a halt in February 1504 when William Courtenay was arrested and thrown in the Tower of London for supporting Edmund de la Pole's claim to the throne as the last male Yorkist claim. It had been nearly 2 decades since Henry VII ascended the throne, and it always surprises me how these men just could not move past it. He was married to their cousin, a Yorkist princess, and yet that wasn't enough for him to secure his throne. The ambition of men wanting more power honestly leads to dangerous choices. William learned this the hard way. An act of attainder was passed against him, meaning no trial, and he lost everything, all of his inheritance. He would sit in the Tower for years until the reign of Henry VIII. Meanwhile, Katherine was kept at court and continued her duties to her sister, the Queen. Elizabeth of York not only took care of her sister, but made sure that her children were well cared for as well, and also paid for the needs of her imprisoned brother-in-law, William. When Katherine and William's second son died unexpectedly in June 1502, Katherine was unable to pay for the funeral services, let alone her own mourning wardrobe. And once again, her sister Elizabeth stepped in and covered the costs. One thing that we can tell for sure is that these York princesses really appeared to have a strong bond. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, he released his uncle William from the Tower of London and restored him to his inheritance. However, it is unclear whether or not William lived to witness this restoration. His father died in 1509, and then William became the Earl of Devon. William Courtenay, Earl of Devon, died in June 1511 at the Palace of Placentia of what was believed to be Pleursy. Katherine would not remarry. She was widowed at the age of 31 and instead took a vow of celibacy in the presence of the Bishop of London. She spent the remainder of her days either at Tiverton or Colcombe Castle in Devon. However, when Henry VIII and Katherine of Aragon had Princess Mary, Katherine was named as a godmother to the infant princess. Katherine held a significant role in Devon as a princess and the Countess of Devon, and is one of the most powerful families in the area. Between her estates, her annual income was about £2,750, which is close to about £1.5 million today. She lived an active life in her widowhood, and in the 1520s, she was known to still go on hunts. She loved listening to music, and she even had 3 jesters. In her final years, it was most important to Katherine to take care of her children, her son Henry and her daughter Margaret. She worked to make sure that her son would inherit all that was owed to him. And as far as her daughter, she worked to find her an adequate marriage. She would go on to wed Henry Somerset, the eldest son and heir of Charles Somerset, 1st Earl of Worcester. In the spring of 1527, Katherine had her will made, and in November, she died at Tiverton Castle. She was about 49 years old. This June, I've been invited by the current owners of Tiverton Castle for a stay. And while I'm there, I'll have the opportunity to see Katherine's tomb. I can't wait to immerse myself in this Devon history and come back and share more great stories with you. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.